Traditionally, the Egyptian monarchy was a father-son affair. But what happens when a commoner becomes the pharaoh? This was the question confronting Horemheb, who had been a high-ranking general and government official during the days of Tutankhamun. Following Tutankhamun's death, around 1330 BCE, Horemheb himself seized power and became the new king of Egypt. But since Horemheb already had a career before becoming pharaoh, he had established a tomb in the necropolis of Saqqara. This monument was rediscovered in the 1970s, and within it, archaeologists found elaborate artistic scenes that chronicled the career of the general. This pre-royal tomb for Horemheb is one of the most interesting of the period, and in this livestream recording, we're going to explore it in detail and see what can be learned about Horemheb as a man and the society in which he lived. A society that was still grappling with the after effects of Akhenaten's revolution. The impact of that revolution was still being felt, both in religious thought and in art. We can see all of this in Horemheb's tomb. Okay, so we'll start with Saqqara. The Saqqara tomb is located over here in this New Kingdom cemetery, which is just south of the Step Pyramid and south of Unas. Egyptologists refer to the cemetery as the Unas South Cemetery because it seems to be limited to the north by the causeway of Unas, which runs all the way from his pyramid down to the Nile Valley. That kind of marks the northern extension of this New Kingdom cemetery that develops. The cemetery itself kind of builds slowly through the 18th dynasty. The tomb of Horemheb is not the first to be constructed in this region. It's just the largest and most famous. But at least a few generations before him, high-ranking officials had started to use this escarpment or plateau to build their little tombs and burial places. So the first thing to notice about Horemheb's tomb, and it's something that is particularly prominent at this cemetery, the Unas South Cemetery, is that it's designed as what we call a temple tomb. It looks, on the surface, kind of like an Egyptian temple. It has the pylon gateway. It has a pillared courtyard just behind that, which is open to the air. It then has a closed or sort of restricted section, which is blocked with a wall and doors that people can only access if they are privileged, if they have permission to enter. And then it has the inner courtyard, which is pillared and decorated. And that's where you will find the shaft leading to the burial. And then just behind that courtyard, there is a trio of small chapels or sanctuaries, which we call a tripartite sanctuary, just like you would find in your average Egyptian temple of the New Kingdom period. So it's a temple, kind of like Karnak, Medinet Habu, Luxor, that sort of thing, but with a tomb inserted beneath the ground. And this artist, Jean-Claude Gauvin, does amazing archaeological reconstructions. I'll put a link to his website in the description when I release this, because he makes the most beautiful art with really wonderful details. Anyway, he's done a really nice job here of conveying the substructure of the tomb, which, if you've ever looked at an archaeological map of these monuments, they can be quite confusing to read, and you really have to layer it in order to understand what's going on. So the shaft descends down, and there's these sort of small chambers and corridors, and then it goes further down with another shaft, and it gets more and more complex as it goes. And I'll get into some of the reasons for that a little bit later. But this little sort of diagram or artistic work should give you a nice idea of how the monument kind of would have looked historically. Obviously, it's a little bit colorless. The original would have been a bit brighter. Just got a chat message for some reason. Okay. It would have been a bit brighter, so it would have been used partly for the memory of Horemheb. So when we say a temple, we sort of imagine that parts of it are accessible to the public. And chances are the very front section of the monument might have been accessible to the public. but the inner section behind this sort of bastion here would have been closed and restricted, probably to family members or privileged members of Horemheb's extended client network, the people who followed him, who sort of supported him in life, and whose families maybe helped fund his temple in death. But the front section might have been publicly accessible, where people could leave offerings for the king, or rather for the official, if he had stayed an official. And these kind of monuments, just like any tomb chapel, like the ones you see in Luxor or in any major cemetery, they are partly public, partly places for memorializing the deceased and providing offerings for him. So, a couple of fun things about the structure itself is that, based on the archaeological work that has taken place here since the mid-1970s, essentially, digging down into the foundations, trying to discern the origins of the monument, the archaeological teams have discovered, or at least established, that it actually developed in stages. It started out in one shape, a lot smaller than what it turned into, and then it seems to have expanded, and this almost certainly reflects the rise in Horemheb's fortunes as he goes from, say, a mid or maybe prominent official to somebody who is really high up in the government administration, and then basically a king in all but name. And even a little bit after he becomes king, it continues getting used. Another noteworthy feature is that this tomb in particular, but the cemetery generally here, wasn't invented in the 18th dynasty. There had been an earlier cemetery here during the Old Kingdom, and some of the shaft tombs that were used by Old Kingdom officials to bury themselves and their families were actually reused in the New Kingdom, including by Horemheb. The first part of the underground structure is actually Old Kingdom, and he seems to have taken this, demolished or swept away whatever structure was on top of it, possibly a small mastaba or maybe a small chapel, and he's reused that little shaft section and expanded it for his own purposes and built this temple tomb on top. So the archaeological work here, which is published very extensively, actually, for a single monument, really gives an interesting sense of how these sites continually get reused over time. They're not static. They are living, sacred sites that later generations will happily revisit and, if necessary, clear away what was there, or at least reuse it for their own purposes. So just to give you a sense of the very similar construction of the temple tomb to a larger cult center, on the left we have the memorial temple of Ramesses III at Medina Habu, and on the right we have Horemheb's monument, and you can see the very strong similarities in their design. The Medina Habu temple is obviously larger, more complicated, more structures, more rooms within it, but the basic template is there, which Horemheb and other New Kingdom officials use for their monuments. This is the tomb as it appears today in the background there. The monument, this is the largest of the tombs in this little cluster. It looks like the smallest, but that's because it's the furthest away and it extends a little bit behind these buildings. Just in front of it, we have the tomb of Tia and Tia. That is a husband and wife couple who have, at least in English, the same name, but notably Tia, as opposed to Tia, is actually the sister of Ramesses II. She is the daughter of Seti I, and she and her husband build their tomb here, right next door to Horemheb's. They actually, not just next door, they actually use part of his masonry as the wall for their own monument. Quite an interesting development that I will talk about in the future. And then here on the right, this beautifully rebuilt mud brick pylon is the tomb of Maya. And this is the male Maya, who is prominent in Tutankhamun's government. He is the official of the treasury, the head financier of the regime. And he also builds a lavish temple tomb, not as large and not as impressive as Horemheb's, but he builds a very nice monument right next door to Horemheb. So if you were looking at it chronologically, the Horemheb tomb is the first. Maya builds his tomb second. And then later, about 20 years later, Tia and Tia insert their own monument in between the two. Obviously, that raises all kinds of questions about the relationships between these people, whether there are, if not family relationships, at the very least patron-client network relationships that are encouraging them to cluster together in this way. But that's a topic for another day. I could easily do a whole lecture just on that, so we're going to leave it for now. So, the layout of Horemheb's tomb is relatively simple when you're looking at it from the top. This is the archaeological plan presented by Geoffrey Martin. Geoffrey Martin passed away last year, I think, but he was the head of the expedition, the Egypt Exploration Society expedition that rediscovered Horemheb's tomb. The tomb of Horemheb had been discovered in the 1800s. It was partially visible on the surface, and travelers especially from the Netherlands had collected some of the decorated blocks that were on the surface and taken them to museums, most notably Leiden. But then in the 1970s, the Egypt Exploration Fund, I think it was at the time, got the concession to return to this part of Saqqara and begin new excavations. And they weren't intending to, but in the process, they rediscovered the location of Horemheb's tomb. And subsequently, there was about 10 to 15 years of excavations in the monument, which are the results of which are actually still being published. It's a very, very thoroughly documented tomb. There's at least 4 to 5 volumes published just on this one monument now, and they're all very detailed. Anyway, we start in the first courtyard, which is pillared, so it's a Peri style, surrounded by columns. You then move into the statue room that has, here to the left and right of the doorway, statues of Horemheb, which would be viewed and venerated by those visiting the monument. 2 sort of side chapels and or storage rooms off to the sides. Then we have the second courtyard, the shaft to the burial chambers, which I showed you before, and then finally that tripartite chapel design with slots for statuary or stelae that would be established to venerate Horemheb and his family. The monument really is designed basically along the template of a temple. So here we are in the outer courtyard, just in front of just behind the entrance pylon. And you can see it extends quite a ways back. Then there's that's the doorway leading to the inner courtyard. And we get our first glimpse as we move deeper of the really beautiful decoration which appears in this tomb. I'll talk in more detail about the artistic style later in the discussion, but to begin with, we get a really highly detailed sense of Horemheb's resources. He's able to fund an incredibly comprehensive and extremely detailed artistic style. When you compare his work, or the work of his tomb, to contemporaries, even somebody like Maya, they also might have beautiful art, but it's just not as extensive, it's not as detailed, it's not as elaborate in its compositions or what is included. Horemheb is operating on another level of resources. He's able to pay artists to spend days or weeks or months carefully chiseling out every single section that he wants, painting it, adding the hieroglyphs, including all sorts of fine details, like it's hard to see on this angle, but you can see the pleats on his robe, the sort of translucence that comes through from the linen, comes across much more easily in the line drawing, which is why I include these, and the incredibly fine detailing on his hair or his wigs and those of the priests. So this just gives you a sense of how exquisitely carefully these things are designed and carved. This is the second courtyard of the monument. This little metal plating is the shaft for the burial chamber. Obviously, we don't want people falling down there, so the Ministry of Antiquities or the expedition has installed protective barriers, and we don't want rubbish going down there or anybody just climbing down. It's covered over with a nice new roof to protect it. Many of these columns, like these ones, these are modern restorations, but then we also have the ancient ones here that have been rebuilt. They obviously had collapsed over time, but they've been put back together. Now, the decoration of Horemheb's tomb is historically significant. I obviously talked about it a lot more in the podcast itself, so I'm just going to highlight a few interesting details here. One of the famous scenes, and this is no longer present in the tomb. This is now in a museum in Leiden. It's one of those blocks I mentioned earlier that they collected from the surface. But it shows Horemheb twice standing before a king and queen. So Horemheb is in the center. He is depicted as an Egyptian official wearing a sort of heavy wig, carrying a fan, an ostrich feather fan, which is a prominent part of the iconography for high-ranking officials. If you think of the idea of a fan bearer, somebody who's waving the fan, like in Hollywood movies, keeping the monarch cool, the important thing about them is they are close to the ruler. They are physically close, so they're obviously trusted. They have to be in a position where they could, if not trustworthy, be a threat. So by this point, to be a fan bearer, or at least to have that title, suggests a great deal of closeness and trustworthiness with the monarch. Kind of like how in the Old Kingdom, we see the hairdressers and the manicurists, they were especially prominent because they were close to the ruler. By the New Kingdom, it's become more focused on the fan bearer. Anyway, Horemheb appears twice. First, he is standing, bending down to speak to some of his servants or royal officials who are interpreters. It's the same dude depicting twice, just like this. But basically the interpreter is speaking to a group of prisoners who in this case appear to be Canaanites, Syrians, even Hittites in some cases. He speaks to them. Apparently he speaks their language, or he has learned it. He then reports to Horemheb, who receives it, and then Horemheb passes that on to the king and queen. You can't have the monarch, the pharaoh, the ruler of all lands, speaking directly to such lowly people as these captive prisoners. And even then, Horemheb himself doesn't speak directly to them, partly because he maybe can't. But he receives the report, he passes it on to the king. That kind of raises all sorts of questions as to what is going to be lost in translation and then through the repetition. If you ever played that childhood game where you sit in a circle and sort of whisper around to each other, chances are it's going to get distorted. But that kind of just makes amusing, gives an amusing idea of sort of misunderstandings or misinterpretations in the court, because there's so many layers of communication before it actually reaches the monarch. Anyway, here's the line drawing that gives you a sort of better sense of the detailing and maybe makes the actual scene itself a bit clearer. I often find, even though line drawings don't look as nice in a presentation, they are actually what I tend to use for research. They're much more legible because depending on the skill of the epigrapher, they usually have gone through very carefully. Like, I've done this myself. You can spend all day on a single block or multiple days. So this scene may not look very fancy, but it's probably taken a experienced epigrapher at possibly a week of work to meticulously copy this in such detail. Maybe not a week, maybe 3 or 4 days, but still. They're much more useful for research, so if you're ever the sort of person who wants to dive deeper into the iconography of scenes, highly recommend trying to find the line drawings of something as much as finding the photo, because you're going to get details that are simply much harder to see and much more vulnerable to lighting. You see the queen here on the left, she's in shadow because of the way they've lit these particular blocks. It can be hard to get the details. Thanks to the copying, you can see it very clearly what she's wearing, what she's holding, that kind of thing. Anyway, the blocks with the king and queen do not have their heads, unfortunately, and they also don't have the hieroglyphs that identify them, which does raise, technically, some uncertainty as to which monarch is depicted. The the rise of Horemheb basically seems to come out of nowhere in the regime of King Tutankhamun. Before Tutankhamun, we don't have any evidence for Horemheb. There is another official who might be Horemheb with a different name, but in terms of that man, Horemheb, he appears fully formed in the regime of Tutankhamun as a prominent official. But presumably he didn't achieve that status overnight. Like, granted, he might have achieved it partly because Tutankhamun was young, he was inexperienced, he was at the mercy of his courtiers, but Horemheb would have had to be in a position of power already in order to manipulate that situation to his advantage. Which is just a long way of saying we're not entirely sure if Horemheb reaches his great prominence first under Tutankhamun, or if he had already achieved that partly under Akhenaten, or perhaps Nefertiti, acting as either co-regent or pharaoh in her own right. The artistic style itself doesn't really help with this, because it's basically classic late Amarna. You tend to think of Amarna art as being that sort of exaggerated, distorted style, but that is more common in the early phase of Akhenaten's reign, say the first 5 years for sure, and the first 10 years to a lesser extent. In the second decade, the style kind of softens, either because the artists have finally figured out how to convey Akhenaten's unique ideas in a way that is both theologically or politically acceptable, but also aesthetically pleasing. But by the end of the reign, they've become quite skilled at presenting things in the elongated, beautiful manner in which Akhenaten is favored, but also something quite beautiful. And this artistic style completely matches that. You know, you couldn't look at these blocks definitively. You couldn't look at these blocks and definitively say it is this king or this king based purely on the style. There might be little giveaways in some of the smaller details, but just as a whole. But we do have a very strong reason for suspecting that it is Tutankhamun, because a few years ago, in 2016, well, technically in the late 1990s, some locals at Abu Sir had found some blocks they were using in their house. The Ministry of Antiquities became aware of this and recovered the blocks. And with epigraphic study, they turned out to be blocks depicting Tutankhamun. And they show Tutankhamun in ways that we don't normally see from his reign, or at least that haven't normally survived. And that includes him shooting a bronze arrow. This is a sort of an ingot made of copper, which they tend to appear, especially in trading scenes. People will bring these large they're shaped like ox hides, ingots of copper. And we do have physical examples from shipwrecks and things. Tutankhamun is shooting one of these with his bow and arrow because he's such a strong warrior he can punch a hole through metal. And then in the other scene we have the classic image of the pharaoh smiting his enemies. In this case, a northerner, like somebody from Canaan or Syria, and a southerner, somebody from Wawat or Kush. These are actually two blocks that join. I've smushed them together in the image, but these lines actually go together. Anyway, the artistic style, it doesn't come across in these line drawings, but the artistic style is quite consistent with probably the monument of Horemheb, most likely in its later phase. We'll talk about that in a bit later. And the scholars who published it, most notably William Raymond Johnson, argued quite strongly that it's almost certainly from the tomb of Horemheb, or at least one of the nearby contemporaries. But the point is, this kind of gives us the best clue that those two rulers whom Horemheb appears before most likely is Tutankhamun. It was the obvious answer, but it's nice to have some degree of confirmation from at least a contemporary source. So one of the notable scenes or things that appears in Horemheb's tomb is him being rewarded for his military service or for his victories on behalf of the pharaoh. In this case, he stands before the ruler, who, again, the blocks, the actual image of the king is lost, and servants clasp sort of beaded collars around him. These necklaces, which physical examples do survive, they're sort of little discs. The ones that survive tend to be faience, but I think we're supposed to interpret these as being gold, because they appear in the same way that gold is usually depicted in these kind of terms. So it's supposed to convey the idea that he's being rewarded with collar after collar after collar, all the jewelry in the world, because he's such an accomplished governor and leader. These are more blocks from the Leiden collection. The tomb itself today does have replicas of these blocks. They've created, stone copies to put in the wall to show you how it used to look. But the originals, which still feature some of the paint, are largely in museum collections. And I just wanted to highlight this one because it shows a really nicely detailed scene of northern prisoners, including what seem to be Canaanites and Syrians being brought before the ruler as prisoners. And it even includes this lovely little image of a woman carrying her children on her shoulder and in a papoose around her neck. Historically, or in context, not the nicest scene. Entire communities are being depopulated for the glory of the pharaoh. But the artists have done a really nice job of conveying firstly, the variety of people involved, and the smaller details of who is actually coming as part of this procession. Okay. So I mentioned earlier that Horemheb's tomb didn't start out that size and that shape the whole time. I've been talking a while. If you look at the foundations of the monument, which the archaeologists have dug down to trace its actual construction, it does seem like the tomb started out as something like this, quite small. The 3 little chapels, the decorated courtyard, the burial shaft. The whole monument is probably oriented around that shaft because that was already there from the Old Kingdom. So they've designed the tomb around that to incorporate it. It then has a small courtyard at the front with a sort of either just a stone or mud brick barrier or possibly a small pylon to give it that temple front. But then this section out here gets demolished or gets redesigned, I should say. And it gets turned into this, which is the form that we see it in today, where it has a statue room in the center and it has 2 small chambers to either side. Basically, they add 2 new walls into the middle of that courtyard. If I go back, you can see. Add 2 new walls, do a bit of a knock through here to create new doorways, and then they add another new curtain wall at the front to create an open air courtyard. No columns in this section. It's just fronting out onto the road or the desert. So it's more just like a veranda, if you will. And then finally, it gets changed again into its completed form, which has the large stone pylons. Columns are added to this courtyard. It's also slightly expanded. Yes, somewhat expanded from the previous version. And then a further extension is added out the front for worshippers, guests, visitors to come and see the glory of Horemheb. So this is the second courtyard with the shaft leading down to the burial chambers. I'll talk about the burials in Horemheb's Saqqara tomb later in the presentation, because there are some interesting stories there. One thing I will point out is that here you can see these darker slabs on the wall. These are those replicas that I was talking about. They've used local stonemasons to create exact copies of the original blocks, and they've put them here so you can get a sense of how the decoration was. These blocks here are original, so they know where they go, they know where they line up, but it gives a sense of how it would have looked.